In 2010, in a small town named Oakridge, Oregon, a series of horrifying crimes involving inhumane acts took place, shaking the public across the United States. The story below recounts the hunt for the perpetrator and the unsolved mysteries. The first case, the missing college student. It all began on a cold March night in 2010. Sarah Dillon, a 22-year-old college student at Oregon State University, was last seen leaving the Oakridge Mall just a little after 9 p.m. Friends described her as a diligent student, a vibrant spirit with a radiant smile, and someone who would never wander off without notifying her family or roommates. That night, Sarah had texted her roommate to let her know she was heading home after buying some groceries and a new dress for an upcoming event. "Be home in 30 mins," read the text. But Sarah never made it back. When the clock struck midnight and there was still no sign of her, worry began to set in. Calls to her phone went unanswered and her social media remained inactive. By morning, her friends filed a missing persons report, which the local Oakridge police initially treated casually. It was not unusual for young adults to go off-grid temporarily. She probably spent the night at a friend's house, the officers suggested, but her family knew better. Sarah was responsible and would never let people worry unnecessarily. By the third day, the small town's tranquility was shattered when her body was discovered on the rocky banks of Lowell Creek, secluded behind an overgrown trail just outside town. The scene was grotesque. Sarah's body bore signs of unspeakable violence. Deep lacerations covered her torso, and her wrists and ankles were bruised as though she had been restrained. Her cause of death was ruled as blood loss from multiple injuries, though medical examiners were quick to point out the lack of any evidence suggesting sexual assault. This detail puzzled investigators. "She was tortured," Police Chief Dale Hammond grimly stated during the first official press conference. "There's no other way to describe it. The person who did this is methodical, deliberate, and dangerously depraved." The town of Oakridge was in chaos. Sleepy and picturesque, the community had been known more for its lush hiking trails and birdwatching spots than for violence. Crime was rare, let alone a grisly murder. Residents turned their small town into a fortress overnight, locking doors that were often left open and eyeing strangers with suspicion. The investigation into Sarah's death took a chilling turn when forensics discovered strange carvings etched into her forearm, symbols that appeared ritualistic in nature. Experts were called in to decipher them, but answers were elusive. "The markings seem to follow no known language or cult practices," said Dr. Allison Fry, a criminologist assisting on the case. The search for clues took officers to Sarah's life, her friends, her professors, her ex-boyfriends, anyone who may have held a grudge against her. But by all accounts, she was kind and well-liked. "No suspects, no witnesses, no motive," said Detective Ben Wallace, shaking his head as he reviewed the case files during a late-night session. "Who would do this to such a kind-hearted girl?" The city set up tip hotlines and distributed flyers with Sarah's picture. The FBI was eventually brought in, suspecting that Sarah's case might not be an isolated event. Pressure mounted as media coverage became relentless, reporters dubbing the case the Oakridge Nightmare. Despite their efforts, days turned to weeks with no significant breakthroughs. Sarah's parents tearfully spoke to cameras during vigils pleading for justice. "We just want answers," her mother, Elaine Dillon, sobbed during one such gathering. "Who took our Sarah and why? She didn't deserve this." One witness stepped forward, a young hiker who claimed to see a lone figure in a black hoodie walking along Lowell Creek on the night Sarah disappeared. The man was reportedly carrying what looked like a duffel bag, but when pressed for further detail, the hiker admitted he hadn't seen the person's face due to the darkness. The limited lead heightened the foreboding sense that this wasn't random. Whoever had killed Sarah had done so with precision and clear intent. The town in turmoil, a conspiracy of fear. The murder of Sarah Dillon hit the town of Oakridge like a thunderbolt, ripping through what was once a quiet, tightly knit community. Known for its serene hiking trails, small diners, and the kind of charm only found in rural America, Oakridge had never been the site of anything remotely resembling violent crime. The streets were usually bustling with friendly faces, children ran free in the parks, and front doors were rarely locked. But after Sarah's murder, the atmosphere changed overnight. "People here have always been trusting," said Margaret Blake, a middle-aged librarian at the town's only public library. "We'd leave our doors open for neighbors, wave to strangers passing through town. Now we just look at each other with suspicion, and nobody feels safe anymore." Almost immediately, residents began locking their doors and installing extra security measures. Window locks and motion sensor lights sold out at the local hardware store in mere days. Parents escorted their children to and from school, refusing to let them play outside unsupervised, and older residents who once enjoyed long evening strolls now stayed indoors after dusk, afraid of what might lurk in the shadows. But it wasn't just the protective measures that signaled a change. Paranoia and fear crept into every corner of daily life. Rumors swirled in whispered conversations across town, at church pews, supermarket aisles, and even the town square. Was this the act of someone local or an outsider passing through? Could it happen again? And most terrifyingly, was there a serial killer in their midst? Rick Johnson, the owner of a popular diner on Main Street, vividly recalled the shift in behavior. People stopped coming out after dark. My diner used to stay open late for the night crowd, but for the last 2 weeks we've been closing at 8 p.m. Folks just aren't willing to risk being out, even if it's just a walk to their car. It's like living in a ghost town now. The murder had shattered the idyllic illusion of safety that residents had long taken for granted. The normally bustling Central Park was eerily empty, the swings motionless in the cold wind. The once friendly Oakridge now felt like a desolate place haunted by an unseen menace. The fear was compounded by the mysterious nature of the crime itself. The community couldn't wrap their heads around the brutality inflicted on Sarah Dillon. The rituals carved into her flesh, the strange lack of motive, and the sheer violence of the act made the crime feel almost otherworldly. It was unlike anything the typically uneventful town had ever experienced. The brutality of it was like something you see in horror movies. Not real life. And definitely not Oakridge, said town pastor Charles Emery, shaking his head during a candlelight vigil held in honor of Sarah. It's shaken our faith, our belief that good always triumphs over evil. The local police were overwhelmed by the growing fear, which quickly escalated into frustration as days passed without any major leads. Hotline calls brought in a flood of tips, but most turned out to be dead ends. Misheard conversations, shadowy figures seen out of the corner of someone's eye, or simple fabrications born of the community's frantic need for answers. Even the arrival of FBI agents did little to soothe the nerves of a town on edge. Rather than feeling reassured, the sight of federal agents in their black suits and SUVs only underscored how serious the situation had become. "It's bad if the FBI has to come all the way out here," muttered one shop owner as he watched them comb through the neighborhood. "I thought things like this only happened in big cities, not here." As media attention poured in from across the country, Oakridge became a hotspot for reporters desperate to cover America's newest serial killer. Reporters set up camp outside the police station. News vans became a fixture along Main Street, their satellite dishes towering awkwardly against the quaint storefronts and picket fences. For the first time in its long history, the town was at the center of a national spectacle. "It's humiliating," said Lindsay Carter, a retired teacher. "Strangers come here with their cameras and fly drones over our homes looking for sensational headlines, as if this is some reality TV drama and not the horrific loss of an innocent girl's life." The media buzz brought another wave of speculation. Online forums and social media users began theorizing about the case, some posing bizarre and grim scenarios. Whispered fears of cult activity spread like wildfire, with many pointing to the ritualistic patterns found on Sarah's body. Others latched onto the idea that the killer could be someone within the community, an idea that split Oakridge deeply in two. "I don't like this narrative that someone here could have done it," said local mechanic Joe Murphy. "Oakridge may be small, but we don't raise monsters." Yet for others the notion was impossible to dismiss. "Everyone has secrets," Margaret Blake said skeptically. "We work so hard pretending life is perfect here. Maybe someone snapped." Trust eroded. Longtime friends began to view one another with silent wariness. Neighbors ducked behind curtains when strangers, or even familiar faces, knocked on their doors. The Oakridge community, which had prided itself on its unified, welcoming spirit, found itself being torn apart. "I've spent my whole life here. Never thought I'd see people this scared or this divided," said Rick Johnson, shaking his head. "It's like the soul of this town's been stolen." The fear that gripped Oakridge wasn't physical alone. It was deeply psychological, a gnawing realization that safety was no longer guaranteed, even in the most innocent of places. For the first time the people of Oakridge felt vulnerable, exposed to the kind of evil they had only read about in newspapers from faraway cities. As days turned into weeks and no arrests were made, small hints of resignation began to creep in, though no one dared voice it aloud. Could justice truly be served? And even if the killer was eventually caught, could Oakridge ever truly go back to the way it was before Sarah Dillon, lighthearted, trusting, and innocent? "She was the first," murmured Pastor Emery almost to himself, "but God knows she may not be the last." The second killing, the middle-aged woman. It wasn't long before Oakridge's nightmare turned darker. Barely 1 month after Sarah Dillon's brutal murder, the town's fragile sense of safety was shattered again. This time, the victim was a 38-year-old woman named Jennifer Harper, a beloved local florist who had spent most of her life in Oakridge. The discovery of her lifeless body on an April morning marked the second grisly chapter in what would soon become one of the most horrifying murder sprees in Oregon's history. Jennifer was well known in Oakridge for her friendly demeanor and her enchanting flower shop on Main Street. She was the type of person who remembered everyone's favorite blooms, and always had a kind word for anyone who walked through her doors. Friends and neighbors remembered her as a pillar of the community, someone who had brightened countless weddings, funerals, and birthdays with her carefully arranged bouquets. On the evening of April 12th, Jennifer closed up her shop as she had done hundreds of times before. She chatted briefly with her sister on the phone, promising to stop by for dinner that weekend. She then started the 5-minute drive to her home, located on the outskirts of town. But Jennifer never made it home. Her car was found abandoned the next morning on the edge of a hiking trail near Thistle Grove, a forested area popular with nature enthusiasts. Jennifer's purse was still in the car, her wallet untouched, which immediately ruled out robbery as a motive. A search party was quickly assembled, combing through the wooded area with growing dread. By noon, the worst fears of the town were confirmed. Jennifer's body was discovered in a clearing about half a mile from where her car had been left. The scene was grotesque and deeply unsettling. Her body bore the same horrifying signs of torture as Sarah Dillon's, deep gashes across her arms and torso, and evidence that she had been restrained before her murder. Perhaps the most chilling detail was the presence of the same strange symbols carved into her skin, identical to those found on Sarah. The police cordoned off the area immediately, treating it as a critical crime scene. For Detective Ben Wallace, who was already handling Sarah's unsolved case, it was a déjà vu moment that left him visibly shaken. "This monster isn't just targeting young women anymore," he told colleagues at the scene. "He's escalating." Despite Jennifer's older age compared to Sarah, investigators quickly concluded that the two cases were connected. The similarities were undeniable: the torturous methods, the eerie carvings, and the deliberate abandonment of the bodies in remote areas. But what puzzled detectives the most was the lack of any clear motive. Jennifer, like Sarah, had no known enemies. She was single, lived quietly, and was loved by the community. The discovery of Jennifer's body sent shockwaves through Oakridge. If Sarah's death had introduced fear into the town, Jennifer's murder cemented it. The killer's choice of victims now seemed random and unpredictable, leaving everyone feeling like a potential target. "I'm terrified to even step out of my house," said Claire Morgan, a local mother of 3. "If this can happen to someone like Jennifer, it can happen to any of us. How do you protect yourself from something like this?" The Oakridge police and the newly arrived FBI task force poured every resource they had into solving both murders. Evidence collected at Jennifer's crime scene was sent to the state crime lab, but results were slow to come in. Investigators scoured her personal life for any clues: a disgruntled customer, a jealous acquaintance, an ex-boyfriend, but came up with nothing. Jennifer's life, like Sarah's, appeared untarnished by the kind of conflict that might lead to such a violent end. At a press conference following Jennifer's murder, Police Chief Dale Hammond addressed the visibly anxious public. "This is the work of a deranged individual," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "We are doing everything in our power to track this person down, but until we do, we urge everyone to remain vigilant. Avoid traveling alone, especially at night. Lock your doors and report any suspicious activity immediately." Despite these reassurances, paranoia gripped the town. Jennifer's murder, so soon after Sarah's, was no longer seen as an isolated tragedy. The whispers of a serial killer were now being spoken aloud, and speculation about his identity, his methods, his motives, spread like wildfire. National news outlets descended on Oakridge, hungry for details about the murders. The media dubbed the unknown perpetrator the ritual killer, due to the cryptic carvings left on both victims. This new label only heightened the collective anxiety. Churches in the area held emergency prayer vigils, and some residents even contemplated moving away. "I'm thinking about taking my kids and going to stay with my sister in Portland for a while," said Brian Reynolds, a father of 2. Maybe it's just me being paranoid, but if the police can't stop this now, who's to say who's next? Jennifer's friends, meanwhile, were left to grapple with overwhelming grief. Her colleagues at the flower shop closed the store indefinitely, unable to face the sight of her empty station. "She was like family to all of us," said Linda Carpenter, Jennifer's closest friend. "She didn't deserve this, nobody does. But especially not Jennifer. She was the kindest person I've ever known." As the investigations into Sarah's and Jennifer's murders dragged on with no clear breakthroughs, some residents began to lose faith in the authorities. Conspiracy theories began to bubble up in online forums and over cups of coffee at the local diner. Was the killer someone in the town, someone they all knew? Or was he a drifter, an invisible threat passing through Oakridge like a shadow? "It has to be someone who knows these woods," argued Tony Miller, a local handyman. "Nobody from out of town would have known about that clearing where they found Jennifer. That's not on any maps. You'd have to live here, grow up here to know about it." But others refused to believe the killer could be one of their own. "This town isn't perfect, but we don't raise monsters here," said Jessica Hammond, owner of the local bakery. "Whoever did this must have come from somewhere else. They came here thinking they'd find easy prey, but they've got another thing coming." And so, Oakridge remained in limbo, oscillating between fear and defiance, grief and anger. Jennifer's death wasn't just another tragedy, it was a breaking point. The town was now firmly gripped by the chilling realization that they were dealing with a predator, one who was still out there, watching, waiting, and ready to strike again. As the days turned to weeks with no arrests made, Jennifer's sister, Catherine Harper, took to local news stations to plead for answers. "Please don't let my sister's death become just another statistic," she said tearfully. "Whoever did this, they need to pay. For Sarah, for Jennifer, for everyone who's living in fear right now. We deserve justice." Unfortunately for Catherine and the rest of Oakridge, justice would prove elusive for far longer than anyone could have anticipated. The first suspect. As fear consumed the town and pressure mounted on law enforcement, the Oakridge Police Department struggled to find any solid leads. Desperate to produce results, they began to comb through the backgrounds of local residents who might fit the profile of a potential killer. In the face of media scrutiny and growing community paranoia, the need for a suspect, any suspect, became paramount. The first name to surface in their investigation was Patrick Sawyer, a 47-year-old truck driver with a troubled past. Patrick was known around town as a somewhat reclusive figure, often keeping to himself when he wasn't on the road. Though he had never been formally linked to any violent offenses in Oakridge, his previous criminal record raised suspicions. Years earlier, Patrick had been convicted of domestic violence against his ex-wife, a charge that had damaged his reputation and left him isolated in the small-town community. Patrick lived alone on the outskirts of Oakridge in a small, run-down home surrounded by overgrown bushes and an old rusted pickup truck parked out front. Neighbors described him as quiet and odd with a short temper and a sporadic work schedule. "He's the kind of guy you wouldn't really approach unless you had to," said Lisa Cooper, a neighbor who lived 2 houses down the road. "He barely says hello, and when he does, it's with this grumble, like he's annoyed you even spoke to him." When police first visited Patrick's home, they were immediately wary. His demeanor was defensive, almost combative when questioned. "Why are you bothering me?" he snapped, standing on his cluttered porch while the officers explained their reason for showing up. "I don't know anything about some stupid murder. Ask someone else." Patrick's hostility made the officers even more suspicious. Upon further questioning, he admitted to being in Oakridge on the nights both Sarah Dillon and Jennifer Harper were killed, though he claimed he had been alone at home during both times. He had no alibi to corroborate his story. What made things worse for Patrick was his possession of a duffel bag that, coincidentally, matched the description given by the hiker who had claimed to see a figure carrying one near Lowell Creek on the night of Sarah's murder. During a search of Patrick's house, investigators found a black duffel bag tucked into a corner of his living room. While it contained nothing incriminating, just a few tools and spare clothing, its presence still raised eyebrows given the circumstances. "He's exactly the kind of person you'd expect to see in a case like this," said a rookie officer who was part of the team investigating Patrick. "He's got a violent history, no strong alibi, and he matches the eerie vibe of someone who could commit these kinds of crimes." Despite the lack of physical evidence tying Patrick to the murders, the community's collective suspicion fell squarely on him once word got out about his questioning. Rumors spread like wildfire. People whispered about his past, exaggerating his supposed weird habits. Some claimed he had been seen lurking near Jennifer Harper's flower shop before her disappearance, while others speculated he had a hidden obsession with young women. "I've seen him staring at women in the grocery store," one anonymous resident told a local news channel. "He gives me the creeps." The Oakridge police brought Patrick in for further questioning, pushing him harder this time. The interrogation was long and intense, with detectives trying to get a read on whether his evasive mannerisms masked guilt or genuine frustration at being targeted. "The guy doesn't exactly scream innocent," Detective Ben Wallace noted privately to a colleague. "He's defensive, he's got a record, and he gets cagey when you ask the wrong questions. But I can't shake the feeling that we might just be wasting our time here." Nonetheless, Patrick became the police's first serious suspect. His home was searched from top to bottom. Forensic teams combed through his truck and property, looking for anything, blood, fibers, hair, that could link him to the murders. They also took his tools, examining them for any remnants that might connect him to the brutality inflicted on Sarah and Jennifer. However, no incriminating evidence emerged. One of Patrick's co-workers, Bill Harding, came forward to vouch for him. "Patrick ain't the nicest guy, I'll give you that," Bill admitted during an interview. "He's rough around the edges, and yeah, he's got a temper. But a killer? Nah, that's not him. The man just wants to do his job, get paid, and be left alone." The lack of tangible evidence began to weigh heavily on the investigation. The pressure on the police only grew stronger as the media loudly criticized their handling of the case. Headlines like "Police chase dead ends while serial killer roams free" began appearing in local newspapers, further eroding public confidence. Adding to this, Patrick's lawyer aggressively countered the police's narrative, accusing them of unfairly targeting his client simply because of his past mistakes. "Mr. Sawyer has been the victim of a witch hunt," the attorney told reporters outside the Oakridge courthouse. "He has cooperated fully with the authorities and has nothing to hide. It's appalling that they would even consider him a suspect without a shred of real evidence." As the days dragged on, the police were forced to release Patrick, citing insufficient evidence to hold him any longer. His release did little to calm the townspeople. For many, the lack of an alternative suspect convinced them Patrick had simply gotten away with it. Others, however, began to question whether law enforcement was barking up the wrong tree altogether. When push comes to shove, all they've got on Patrick is his history and some circumstantial nonsense, noted Pastor Charles Emery during a community meeting. "No one wants to admit it, but we might have just wasted weeks chasing the wrong person. And that only means one thing: the real killer is still out there." Patrick, for his part, remained bitter and resentful about the entire experience. Speaking to a reporter weeks after his release, he kept his comments brief. "I didn't do it," he said bluntly, "but go ahead and think what you want. This town's already decided I'm guilty anyway." For the authorities, Patrick's case marked a frustrating dead end, but it also underscored a terrifying truth. Whoever the killer was, he was smart, careful, and calculated, a predator who knew exactly how to stay one step ahead of the law. And with Patrick no longer in custody, the Oakridge police found themselves back at square one, with no clear answers and an entire town growing more terrified by the day. Still, beneath the surface of this apparent calm, there were whispers among law enforcement that the department might already have the killer in their midst, they just didn't know it yet. The third murder, the nightmare, at the abandoned house. By the time June rolled around, whispers of unease had become a steady drumbeat of palpable fear in Oakridge. 2 murders were bad enough to destroy the town's fragile sense of security, but when a third killing occurred, it tipped the community over the edge. What was once anxiety turned into outright panic. The townsfolk began to feel as though no one, regardless of age, gender, or location, was safe. The victim was Emily Wright, a vibrant 17-year-old high school senior who radiated the youthful energy of someone with her whole life ahead of her. Well-liked by her teachers and adored by her friends, Emily was active in school plays and dreamed of moving to Los Angeles to become an actress. That dream, however, came to a grisly end on a warm June night when she ventured out with her friends for what should have been an innocent teenage outing. On the evening of June 15th, Emily, along with a group of 5 close friends, decided to sneak away to an abandoned house on the outskirts of Oakridge to tell ghost stories and have harmless fun. The house, once belonging to a wealthy lumber baron in the 1920s, had been abandoned for decades and was surrounded by rumors of being haunted. Teens often dared one another to visit the creaky, decaying mansion during summer nights, but no one expected it to become the site of unspeakable horror. Sometime after midnight, the group decided to split up, seeking to increase the thrill of the night by wandering through the dusty, dimly lit rooms with their flashlights. It wasn't long before they realized Emily was no longer with them. At first they thought she was playing a prank, a typical ploy to jump out and scare her friends like characters in a classic horror movie. However, their laughter quickly turned to fear when they found her flashlight smashed on the floor of one of the upstairs bedrooms. "We called her name over and over," recounted Ellie Simmons, one of Emily's closest friends, during an emotional interview with police. "It was so quiet in the house, we thought she might have gone out into the woods to scare us or something, but then we realized she wouldn't just leave her flashlight." When the teens couldn't find Emily, they fled the house and called 911, their voices trembling with fear. Police arrived within half an hour, combing the house and its surrounding grounds with flashlights and dogs. They didn't have to look for long. Behind the house, tucked along the overgrown property line and hidden behind a crumbling stone wall, they found Emily's body. She had been brutally murdered, her lifeless form left sprawled on the makeshift floor of what once had been the gardener's shed, now collapsing with rot. Like the previous two victims, Emily's body bore signs of torture. Her wrists and ankles were bound with frayed rope, and her torso was slashed repeatedly. Most horrifying were the symbols carved into her arms, symbols identical to those found on Sarah Dillon and Jennifer Harper. Inside the shed, the killer had left something new. Strange markings scrawled on the rotting walls in what appeared to be red paint, though investigators would later confirm it to be Emily's blood. The messages were chillingly cryptic, with one reading simply, "Behold my work," and another less legible word that looked like "ascend." The implication that the killer had used the shed as some sort of twisted stage for their actions sent shivers through everyone involved. Detective Ben Wallace, now weathered from months of sleepless nights, was struck speechless when he first arrived at the scene. Each act of violence seemed more depraved than the last. It wasn't just a murder anymore, this was a display, a grotesque performance meant to send a message. "He's not hiding anymore," Wallace finally said to his partner. "He wants us to see this." News of Emily's murder spread like wildfire across the town. While the killings of Sarah and Jennifer had shocked the community, Emily's death shattered them entirely. The randomness of her murder combined with her youth struck a blow that stunned Oakridge residents into grief and fear. "This is a child," said Margaret Blake, the town librarian, tearfully addressing reporters the next morning. "She wasn't even an adult yet. If we're dealing with a monster who can do this to a child, none of us are safe." The dynamics of everyday life in Oakridge changed yet again. Parents forbade their children from leaving their homes at night, locking them indoors even in broad daylight. The local high school canceled its summer drama program in Emily's honor, leaving many students feeling not just grief, but also robbed of their last normality. Businesses began to shut down earlier and earlier, with the once busy streets becoming silent as the sun dipped below the horizon. The FBI labeled Emily's case as a significant escalation in the killer's pattern, but although the behavioral analysis helped paint a chilling picture of the murderer's possible psyche, it provided no direct leads. Investigators combed through the shed and its surroundings looking for fingerprints or DNA, but they found maddeningly little. The killer seemed meticulous, leaving no trace other than splashes of blood and the chilling symbols carved on Emily's skin. Notably, Emily's case introduced a new layer of complexity to the unfolding nightmare, the killer's deliberate choice of location. The abandoned house had been a local legend for decades, a focal point for eerie stories and teenage dares. While it might have originally seemed random, investigators wondered whether it had been chosen intentionally to deepen the psychological impact on the community. "He has an audience now," theorized FBI profiler Jeff Conrad. "This isn't just violence for violence's sake, he's trying to send a message, he wants fear, he thrives on it." Emily's funeral was one of the largest gatherings Oakridge had ever seen. Hundreds of residents, both young and old, showed up to pay their respects to the girl whose bright future had been stolen in such a horrific way. As her tearful parents laid her to rest, the entire town was left grappling with the realization that Oakridge might never truly be the same again. Among the attendees was Pastor Charles Emery, whose somber words lingered with those who heard them. "This is not the work of a man," he said quietly. "This is the work of something darker, something evil." For the people of Oakridge, the line between the real and the superstitious began to blur. Whispers of cults, the supernatural, or even demonic possession darted around the town like lightning. But for Detective Wallace and the FBI, one thing was crystal clear. They were dealing with a psychopath, and unless they acted quickly, Emily Wright would not be the last name added to the growing list of victims. Profiling the killer. By the time Emily Wright's murder added a third name to the growing list of victims, the Oakridge Police Department and the FBI knew they weren't just dealing with a random killer, they were hunting a predator. This wasn't an opportunistic spree or a rage-fueled crime of passion. It was cold, calculated, and deliberate. The level of meticulousness suggested that the murderer had planned each killing with terrifying precision. That's when the FBI decided it was time to dig deeper and build a psychological profile of the person behind these horrific acts. The Behavioral Analysis Unit, BAU, arrived in Oakridge in late June, armed with fresh eyes and a chilling theory. The killings weren't arbitrary but symbolic, tied to a deeper psychological or possibly ideological obsession. The task was to figure out who this killer was, what drove his motives, and how to stop him before he struck again. "What we're looking at is someone who needs total control," said Supervisory Special Agent Jeff Conrad during a quiet briefing with local law enforcement. "The binding of the victims, the ritualistic carvings, the deliberate staging, it all points to a person who thrives on dominance and manipulation. He's playing a game, and unfortunately, he's still winning." The psychological profile. The profile of the suspected killer, often referred to simply as the ritual killer, by both the media and law enforcement, began to take shape. According to FBI profilers, the murderer was likely a male in his late 20s to early 40s. He was someone physically capable of overpowering his victims, but rather than relying on brute strength alone, he seemed to exert mental dominance, possibly using fear or misdirection to control them before ultimately killing them. "Based on what we know, this individual is methodical," Agent Conrad continued. "He likely spends weeks, maybe even months, planning his attacks. He scouts locations, studies his victims' routines, and evaluates his risks. He knows how not to leave evidence behind, which tells us he's done this before, or at the very least, he's studied other killers." The FBI profilers theorized that the killer was highly intelligent, possibly even highly educated. The carvings, though seemingly nonsensical, hinted at someone with a fascination for the esoteric or occult. It might be an interest in ancient symbols, secret societies, or ritualistic practices, but no direct connections to established religions or cults had been found. However, Conrad emphasized the symbols could serve a different purpose entirely. It may not mean anything at all. The carvings could just be his way of leaving his signature, a way of saying to the world, "This is my work." It's a psychological trophy. A familiar face or a drifter? One key question loomed large during the profiling process. Was the killer someone local, or was he an outsider drifting through Oakridge? The FBI leaned toward the theory that the killer had at least some connection to the town or the surrounding area. The bodies were found in locations carefully chosen to avoid detection, yet close enough to frighten the community. "These aren't sites you stumble upon by accident," said profiler Allison Gray. "You'd need to know these woods, these trails. He's comfortable here. That suggests he either lives here or has spent considerable time in the region." Local law enforcement had a harder time accepting the idea that the killer might live among them. "Oakridge isn't that kind of place," said Police Chief Dale Hammond during a press conference. "I know this town. I'd know if there was someone capable of this living here." But as Agent Conrad reminded them, killers rarely fit the stereotypical image of a monster. "He's likely someone who blends in," Conrad explained. "He might have a job. He might have a family. What you're looking for is someone who keeps to himself, someone who seems a little too careful with their routines, but nothing so obvious it would raise immediate suspicions." A history of violence. The killer's method of operation, abduction, torture, symbolic mutilation, pointed to a deep-seated rage, according to the psychology team. "There's something driving this man to lash out this way," said Gray. "Our theory is that he's experienced some trauma or rejection, likely centered around women. The brutality of his crimes, particularly the torture, isn't just about killing, it's about power, revenge, and domination." The BAU believed it was highly likely the killer had a history of violent or deviant behavior, though it might not have been reported or documented. "You don't start with crimes this extreme," Gray stressed. "There's a progression. Maybe he tortured animals as a child. Maybe he committed lesser crimes, breaking and entering, voyeurism, stalking. We need to dig deeper into local reports of suspicious activity. His history is out there. We just need to find it." Social isolation. The FBI also theorized that the killer was socially isolated either by choice or circumstance. He probably didn't have many close friendships or meaningful relationships. This made it easier for him to go unnoticed and, more importantly, unchecked. "We believe he lives alone or in a situation where he has total autonomy over his space," said Conrad. Additionally, while the killer might appear functional in public, holding a steady job or engaging in casual social interactions, his private life would tell a different story. It was likely he harbored obsessive habits such as keeping a collection of trophies related to his crimes, or maintaining detailed journals of his plans and fantasies. "He's meticulous, but careful doesn't mean perfect," Gray added. "A killer like this will slip up eventually, especially as his confidence grows. The escalation of these crimes suggests he's becoming bolder, which increases the chances he'll make a mistake." Targeting trophies. The act of carving symbols into the victim's skin was a signature unlike any they had seen before in regional crimes, but it also hinted at something chilling: the possibility of trophies. "Killers like this often keep mementos to relive their crimes," said Agent Conrad. "We need to look at missing personal items. Jewelry, clothing, anything significant the victims might have had with them. It's not about monetary value, it's about sentimental worth. It's their way of feeding their obsession." The profile's impact on the town. As the FBI shared key elements of their profile with law enforcement, word inevitably began to spread through whisper networks in the community, sparking a new wave of fear and speculation. Some residents believed the killer might be someone they knew, someone they had shaken hands with at the hardware store or crossed paths with at the diner. Others clung to the hope that he was an outsider, a drifter just passing through, whose reign of terror would end as abruptly as it began. "Everyone's scared of their own shadow," lamented Jessica Hammond, a schoolteacher. "Every time a neighbor acts a little off, people start whispering. It's a terrible way to live, constantly wondering if the monster we're hunting is someone we've known forever." A race against time. Despite the insights gained from the profile, there was no denying the urgency of the situation. The killer had already claimed 3 victims in less than 4 months. If the team didn't act fast, it seemed inevitable that he would strike again, perhaps even sooner as his confidence grew. "This isn't over," Conrad warned the officers during a late-night strategy meeting. "In fact, I'd argue it's just beginning. He's not going to stop, not until we stop him, and the clock is ticking." For Oakridge, the psychological profile offered a terrifying glimpse behind the curtain, a portrait of a methodical, intelligent, and deeply disturbed predator. But even with the sketch of his mind laid bare, one question loomed above all else: who? The shocking clue. By August, Oakridge was suffocating under the weight of fear and frustration. 3 murders, all brutal, all connected by an eerie signature. The town was in chaos, its residents terrified to leave their homes after dusk, and every stranger was viewed with suspicion. The FBI and local investigators were running out of leads, and the ritual killer, now a name whispered with a mix of horror and anger, seemed untouchable. But then, a single clue emerged, one that would change the course of the investigation. It was a balmy evening on August 5th, when the Oakridge Police Department received a call from Phil Conway, the owner of a small electronics store on Main Street. Phil explained that a customer had come into the shop the previous month and purchased a discounted outdoor security camera, which had been installed outside his store to monitor deliveries during off hours. Unsure if it would be helpful, Phil mentioned that the camera had caught something weird from a few nights after Emily Wright's murder. The footage had been sitting on the store's computer, unnoticed, until Phil decided to check it out while doing inventory that week. Eager for any break in the case, a pair of detectives went straight to Phil's store to retrieve the footage, though they didn't expect much. After all, grainy security footage wasn't exactly known for solving murders, but when the store's camera technician rewound to the relevant segment, the room went silent. At first, the scene appeared unremarkable: empty streets, dim lights, a stray cat wandering through the frame. But then, at precisely 2:47 a.m., a shadowy figure emerged on screen. The figure moved with an unsettling precision, a lone individual in a black hoodie, walking briskly down the sidewalk with what appeared to be a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He kept his head low, making sure the hood concealed his face from the camera. At one point, he paused for several seconds, seemingly aware of the camera's presence, before disappearing into the shadows beyond the frame. "This has to be him," whispered Detective Ben Wallace as he watched the footage on loop. "Why else would someone be walking around at that hour with a bag no less, not even looking up?" The footage was undeniably chilling, but it wasn't enough to confirm the person's identity. The quality was poor, and the figure's deliberate concealment made it impossible to see their face. Even so, it was the first visual evidence they had of the potential killer, and it gave the FBI something new to sink their teeth into. Analyzing the footage. The FBI immediately took possession of the camera's hard drive, sending it to their forensic video analysis team in Portland. Experts used software to enhance the footage, searching for any distinguishable features. A patch or logo on the hoodie, scuff marks on the shoes, anything. While they managed to sharpen some details, such as the cut of the figure's jacket and the shape of the bag, they had no luck identifying distinguishing physical traits. The duffel bag stood out as a significant detail. It was a common black gym bag, unremarkable at first glance, but potentially tied to the witness statement from months prior, the hiker who had seen a figure carrying a similar bag near Lowell Creek on the night Sarah Dillon disappeared. Investigators speculated that the bag could have been used to transport tools or items connected to the murders. "This isn't random," said Agent Jeff Conrad during a briefing later that week. "You don't walk through Oakridge at 3 a.m. with a bag of stuff unless you're up to something. This guy's confident, but he also knows how to stay unnoticed. He's methodical, but this footage proves he's not untouchable." We're closing in. A town's glimmer of hope. When word about the video inevitably leaked to the Oakridge community, it was met with a mix of relief and renewed fear. On one hand, residents felt hopeful that the killer might finally be closing in on justice. On the other, the grainy, shadowy figure felt more like a phantom than a man, a faceless threat that still loomed over their lives. "It's good they have something," said Jessica Moore, a local waitress, as news of the footage spread through town. "But until they catch him, I'm still not sleeping easy." For the teens of Oakridge High, the footage quickly became the talk of the school. Conspiracies and wild theories spread like wildfire, with students debating whether the figure in the video was someone they knew, a mysterious stranger, or, even more chilling, a teacher or coach lurking in plain sight. A dead end, or a breakthrough? Despite the breakthrough, the footage sparked more questions than answers. Why was the individual walking through this specific area at such a late hour, especially so close to where one of the victims had been discovered? Was he hiding something in the duffel bag, or was it all a coincidence? The police and FBI began canvassing the area captured in the footage, questioning shop owners and neighbors to uncover whether anyone had seen the figure that night. A few individuals remembered hearing faint footsteps or seeing lights flickering outside at odd hours, but none could give investigators a clear lead. One particularly eerie detail emerged during interviews with local residents. An elderly man who lived around the corner from the electronics shop told officers about his dog barking fiercely on the very same night the footage was recorded. "She's a quiet one, my Daisy," he said of the old Labrador, "but that night something spooked her bad. She just stood at the front door growling. I figured maybe it was a raccoon, but now—" He trailed off, shaking his head. Additional cameras in the surrounding area were also checked, but frustratingly, none provided any relevant angles of the figure after they left the first camera's frame. Either the killer knew the blind spots of the neighborhood, or he simply got lucky. The mask detail. Weeks after the video was discovered, the forensic team made one minor breakthrough. By closely analyzing the few frames of footage that showed the individual pausing near the camera, they determined he was wearing a mask, likely a simple store-bought type designed to hide his features. While this detail didn't point to any specific leads, it confirmed one thing: this person wasn't just wandering around aimlessly. They were careful, calculated, and prepared. "He's not impulsive," Conrad observed. "Every choice he makes is deliberate. The mask, the hood, the bag, it's all about control. He knows how to conceal himself, but he's also leaving little crumbs. The longer this goes, the bigger the risk he makes a mistake, and when he does, we'll be there." Closing in on the truth. As investigators pored over the footage again and again, trying to glean every possible hint, they knew the answer to the killer's identity was closer than ever. The clue didn't scream a name or address, but it was a sign of vulnerability, a window into a predator who, until that point, had seemed untouchable. "It's only a matter of time now," Detective Wallace said confidently to his team one evening. "He's slipping up, and when he does, we'll be ready." For a town desperate for closure and justice, the grainy figure walking in the night symbolized both a tangible lead and a demonic reminder. The ritual killer had been there, in their streets, under their noses, and he wasn't done yet. The fourth murder darkness revealed. As August wore on, the haunting presence of the ritual killer seemed to hang over Oakridge like a thick fog. The security footage had created a fragile sense of hope among law enforcement, but progress remained slow. Investigators combed through every possible lead and analyzed the figure caught on camera to no avail. Despite the mounting pressure, they couldn't move fast enough to prevent what came next. On the night of August 22nd, the killer struck again. This time, the death was even more chilling in its execution, leaving Oakridge in a state of utter panic. The victim, Laura James, a vivacious 24-year-old waitress at a popular diner downtown, had finished her shift just before midnight. Known for her bright smile and friendly demeanor, Laura was one of the town's most well-loved residents. Tragically, her walk home became the ritual killer's latest opportunity to spread terror. The discovery. Laura's mangled body was discovered early the next morning in Pinewood Park, a serene location that until then had been a beloved spot for picnics and morning joggers. Park maintenance worker Greg Harrison made the gruesome find. "At first I thought someone was playing a sick joke," Harrison said, his voice shaking in a local news interview. "But when I got closer, I knew this was something much, much worse." Her body was suspended upside down from one of the tall oak trees near the center of the park, tied with ropes that had been carefully knotted to keep her body eerily still in the morning breeze. It was a staging unlike anything seen before in the previous murders, a deliberate display meant to evoke shock and fear. Beneath her corpse, scrawled into the dirt in what investigators quickly confirmed to be her blood, was the chilling phrase, "Justice comes." Detective Ben Wallace arrived on the scene and immediately felt a wave of nausea. "This isn't just murder anymore," he muttered to Agent Jeff Conrad as they surveyed the scene together from a distance. "He's making a statement. He knows we're watching." Laura's body bore all the hallmarks of the ritual killer. Her wrists and ankles were bound, her torso was slashed in the same jagged style, and the now infamous carvings, a collection of cryptic symbols etched deep into her skin, were present once again. However, there were new elements as well, escalation tactics that showed the killer was growing bolder, more theatrical. Staging Laura in Pinewood Park, a public and highly frequented place, sent a clear message. No one was safe, no place too sacred. The victim. Laura's death hit Oakridge especially hard. Unlike previous victims, Laura wasn't isolated or living quietly out of the spotlight. She was a constant presence in the community, serving customers at Angie's Diner every day. Friends, co-workers, and patrons alike described her as the life of the diner, always cheerful, always kind. "She had this glow about her," said Beth Owens, one of Laura's co-workers, during a tearful interview. "Even if you were having the worst day, one smile from her could change everything. Whoever did this, they didn't just take her from us, they took away something good, something pure." Laura's daily routine was predictable and had been carefully observed. Investigators suspected the killer had been watching her for days, perhaps even weeks, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Her route home passed through a small patch of woods on the northern edge of town, a shortcut she always took to save a few minutes after her late-night shifts. Ironically, this well-worn path led straight to her death, the scene of the crime. The park itself became the focal point of the investigation. Forensics teams scoured every inch of the area for clues, rope fibers, traces of dirt, even the faintest suggestion of a trail left behind by the killer. It all became potential evidence. "Something's different here," Agent Conrad told the team after hours of combing through the site. "The location's too deliberate, too public. This isn't his usual MO. He's either taunting us or trying to say something." The graffiti-like blood message on the ground, "Justice comes," also confounded investigators. What justice could the killer be referring to? Was he punishing his victims for imagined crimes? Or was it a twisted joke directed at the police themselves? Without further clarification, the message only deepened the air of mystery and fear. The town in crisis. If Oakridge was on edge after the first 3 murders, the 4th death sent the town spiraling into complete hysteria. Parents refused to let their children leave their homes even during the day. Businesses began closing before dusk, with previously bustling streets becoming eerily silent at night. Neighborhood watch groups sprang up overnight, with armed residents patrolling the streets well into the early hours of the morning. "Every day feels like walking on a razor's edge," said Jessica Hammond, a schoolteacher who had once been an enthusiastic advocate for the town's unity. "We're all looking over our shoulders. People glance out their windows every few minutes and nobody's talking to anyone anymore. This thing, it's eating away at Oakridge." The town held candlelight vigils, memorials, and community prayer meetings, but even these attempts to foster solidarity were tainted by fear. For many residents, the idea of congregating in one place felt like painting a target on their backs. Escalation and meaning. The choice to kill, and then publicly display Laura's body, sent a chilling message not only to Oakridge but also to law enforcement. Agent Conrad argued that the fourth murder marked a significant shift in the killer's behavior. "He's upping the ante," he explained during a tense meeting with his team. "He's no longer operating in the shadows. This wasn't about stealth, this was about spectacle. He knows we're after him, and he wants us to see how untouchable he thinks he is." But others, like Detective Wallace, thought there was more to uncover about the meaning behind the escalating violence. "I don't think he's just showing off," Wallace said, circling evidence photos on the whiteboard. "The park, the message, the way she was tied up, it's personal now. He's trying to provoke something, but what?" Pressure on authorities. The intensity of public outrage after Laura's death reached a boiling point. Protesters gathered outside the Oakridge Police Department holding signs demanding answers as well as direct action. Some accused the police of incompetence, while others blamed them for not acting quickly enough after the previous killings. "It's been months and all you've got is a blurry camera video?" one angry resident shouted during an emergency town hall. Others burst into applause as the statement echoed through the room. Inside the precinct, tension among investigators was equally high. The team faced mounting pressure not only from the media, but also from the FBI's higher-ups, who were growing impatient as more resources were poured into a case with no foreseeable solution. "We're working around the clock," Wallace reminded Agent Conrad bitterly after another sleepless night. "But how do you stop someone who only leaves breadcrumbs when he feels like it?" An ominous cliffhanger. As the sun set over Oakridge and another sleepless night began for its residents, one reality became abundantly clear. The ritual killer wasn't finished. Despite all the efforts, the community braced itself for the horrifying possibility that Laura James might not be the last name etched into this growing nightmare. For now, in the flickering streetlights and shadowed roads, the killer still held all the cards. The killer caught. A shocking revelation. The capture of the ritual killer was almost as unsettling as the murders themselves. After nearly 6 months of fear, chaos, and relentless investigation in Oakridge, a shocking break in the case led to the arrest of Joe Miller, a 35-year-old mortuary assistant who had lived quietly in the periphery of the town's social fabric. While his face was familiar to some, few could have imagined that this unremarkable man, the pale figure who kept to his work in the shadows of grief, would be the monster hiding in plain sight. For law enforcement and the FBI, the arrest was both a relief and a chilling reminder of how close the killer had been all along. The break in the case. The lead came unexpectedly, stemming from a seemingly ordinary routine inquiry. Joe had worked as a mortuary assistant at Oakridge Memorial Funeral Home for over 7 years. Known for his professionalism and ability to handle the grim realities of death, he was respected, but also viewed as a bit strange. Colleagues described him as quiet, overly meticulous, and withdrawn, with little interest in socializing outside of work. It was a minor tip, however, that finally brought him into the spotlight. A co-worker at the mortuary had come forward after noticing that Joe had been acting off for weeks. In particular, he had recently started taking extended breaks and disappearing during shifts without explanation. Paired with this odd behavior, the co-worker recalled seeing a gym-style duffel bag in the corner of Joe's personal locker, matching the description investigators had connected to the crimes. Forensic examiners, desperate for any leads, obtained a warrant to search Joe's home. What they found inside erupted the case wide open. The evidence at home, Joe Miller's small, neatly kept house on the outskirts of Oakridge, told a horrifying story. The first sign that something was deeply wrong came from the basement, a cramped, shadowy space where police discovered a makeshift workshop. The walls were lined with shelves holding surgical tools, scalpels, latex gloves, and sterilized saws, some of which were coated with remnants of blood that subsequent DNA tests confirmed belonged to the victims. Among the surgical instruments sat a collection of grim souvenirs. Investigators uncovered lockets of hair belonging to Jennifer Harper and Emily Wright, as well as a small notebook containing entries written in Joe's tight, controlled handwriting. The notes were chilling confessions of his power over his victims, and detailed instructions on how he had carried out the murders, each account growing more sinister than the last. One of the most shocking discoveries was a stash of clothing belonging to the victims. Wrapped in clear plastic bags, these items, dresses, shirts, shoes, seemed to be trophies, as coldly preserved as the bodies he had left behind. Most harrowing of all was a collection of photographs and sketches pinned to a corkboard, hidden behind a tarp along the far wall. Some were drawings of strange symbols, an exact match for the carvings Joe had inflicted upon his victims' bodies. Others were candid, almost predatory photos of his targets: Sarah Dillon leaving class, Emily Wright rehearsing a school play, Laura James walking home after work. He had been watching them for weeks. The arrest. The night law enforcement descended on Joe Miller's house became a flashpoint in the town's history. Just before midnight, a team of FBI agents and local police surrounded his property. Armed with arrest and search warrants, they knocked loudly at the door. To everyone's surprise, Joe didn't resist. He opened the door as though expecting them, his pale face devoid of emotion. He wore a clean white shirt tucked neatly into dark slacks, as if he'd just gotten home from work. When an officer informed him of the charges against him, Joe simply nodded, quietly saying, "I guess it was going to happen eventually." That eerie calm extended through the arrest and transport back to the local station. Joe answered no further questions, remaining silent except for a peculiar statement mumbled to himself during his mugshot. "They told me this would happen, but I had to finish. I didn't have a choice." A shocking defense. In the days following Joe's arrest, Oakridge was sent reeling once again, but now the questions shifted from who did this to why did he do this? Joe's confession provided some answers, but also new horrors. During his first interrogation, he freely admitted to the murders of Sarah Dillon, Jennifer Harper, Emily Wright, and Laura James. He outlined the sequence of events with chilling precision, even correcting investigators on certain details. In Joe's mind, he wasn't guilty of murder. He described himself as an instrument of a greater force, claiming he had been compelled by voices, a dark entity that demanded obedience. "They spoke to me," he told detectives during the hours-long confession. "They told me to collect, to prepare, the symbols, the blood, the pain. It was all part of what they needed. I was chosen." When pressed further, Joe described elaborate visions of shadowy figures that would visit him late at night. According to his account, they instructed him on how to choose his victims and what rituals to perform. He described the act of carving symbols into his victim's flesh not as a form of sadism, but as a necessary mark to fulfill the sequence. To investigators, it became painfully clear that Joe was living in a reality created entirely by his fractured mind. A troubled history. As Joe Miller's life was dissected by the media and the FBI, more unsettling details about his past came to light. In his teenage years, Joe had suffered from severe mental health issues that had gone largely untreated due to his family's financial struggles. School counselors had reportedly flagged signs of psychosis, noting his obsession with death, his fascination with anatomy, and his troubling habit of sketching symbols and graphic depictions of violence in the margins of his schoolwork. After dropping out of high school, Joe drifted aimlessly before finding work as an apprentice at the Oakridge mortuary, where his quiet demeanor and aptitude for handling mortality made him a natural fit for the profession. However, the occupation seemed to fuel his darker tendencies. His colleagues would later recall his odd behaviors, refusing to socialize, taking long hours in the embalming room, or sometimes appearing unnervingly focused during autopsies. The town reacts. The revelation that Joe Miller, a man whose job had placed him at the periphery of every grieving family, was the ritual killer sent shockwaves through Oakridge. Residents were horrified to learn that someone so ordinary and unassuming had been hiding such darkness. "It's like a nightmare you can't wake up from," said Lisa Moore, a mother who had known Joe casually at the diner where Laura James worked. "To think he was just walking around day after day like the rest of us, how could we not see it?" But others couldn't dismiss the eerie tragedy beneath Joe's crimes, the years of untreated mental illness that had festered into something unforgivable. "The system failed," said Margaret Blake, the town librarian. "He should have been helped. Someone should have stopped this before it ever began. Now it's too late. Too late for him and too late for all those lives he took." The fallout. Even after his arrest, questions lingered. How much of Joe Miller's reality was shaped by his fractured psyche, and how much of it was deliberate evil? Was this truly the work of one man, or were there deeper, darker forces, literal or metaphorical, that had enabled such atrocities to happen? Awaiting trial, Joe Miller sat in silence behind bars, offering no further answers. For Oakridge, the lingering ghosts of his crimes were far from laid to rest. The trial unanswered mysteries. The trial of Joe Miller, dubbed the ritual killer by the media, was one of the most chilling and controversial courtroom sagas in recent American history. For the people of Oakridge, it wasn't just about seeking justice. It was about understanding how their small, idyllic town became the backdrop for evil of such magnitude. Yet, even after the gavel struck and the prosecution presented its case, the trial left more questions than answers. What drove Joe Miller to commit these horrifying acts? How could someone so ordinary hide such deep darkness? And most puzzling of all, were his claims of being driven by voices genuine or a calculated attempt to escape accountability? A town holds its breath. By the time the trial began in late 2012, Oakridge had endured nearly 2 years of fear, grief, and trauma. The murders of Sarah Dillon, Jennifer Harper, Emily Wright, and Laura James had left permanent scars on the community. Families were torn apart, neighbors turned suspicious of one another, and the once quiet town became synonymous with terror nationwide. When Joe Miller entered the courtroom for the first time, shackled and dressed in an orange jumpsuit, silence swept through the packed gallery. His demeanor was as unnerving as ever, calm, almost detached, as though the proceedings carried no weight for him. He rarely glanced at the dozens of family members, reporters, and onlookers who had come for answers. His dispassionate expression only deepened the hatred many felt, though some couldn't help but wonder if it was a window into his disturbed mind. The prosecution spared no effort in painting Joe as a cold, calculated predator. District Attorney Margaret Holland delivered a scathing opening statement, describing in detail how Joe had stalked his victims, meticulously planned their horrific ends, and ultimately turned his dark fantasies into reality. This was no accident, Holland declared firmly. This was no moment of passion. Joe Miller committed these murders because he wanted to. He enjoyed it. He thrived on the pain he inflicted, and he reveled in the control he had over their lives. The prosecution's case. Over 6 weeks, prosecutors painstakingly outlined their case using the mountain of evidence collected from Joe Miller's home and the murder scenes. They presented the personal items Joe had kept, lockets of hair, victims' clothing, and photos he had taken while stalking them. Each discovery was shown to the jury on a large screen, their horrific significance explained in stark detail. These items, the prosecution argued, weren't just souvenirs. They were symbols of Joe's sadistic need to relive his crimes. Joe's notebook, discovered in the basement-turned-workshop, contained gruesome entries where he fantasized about inflicting pain and wielding power over his victims. The chilling correspondence between the journal's instructions and the exact manner of the murders was irrefutable. Forensic experts took the stand to connect the surgical tools found in Joe's home with the marks on the victims' bodies. Their testimony left little room for doubt. Joe had managed every detail of his crimes with surgical precision, leaving behind no physical evidence at the murder scenes other than the gruesome carvings he considered his signature. Each piece of evidence drew gasps and tears in the courtroom. Families of the victims sat clutching one another's hands, visibly shuddering as they were confronted with the cold, clinical details of their loved ones' deaths. But if the prosecution painted Joe Miller as a monster, the defense team took a much different route. The defense's dilemma. Joe Miller's defense attorneys faced an uphill battle from the start. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his own confession to law enforcement left little ambiguity. However, instead of attempting to argue innocence, the defense tried to build a narrative of mental instability so deep that Joe couldn't be held accountable for his actions. Throughout the trial, psychologist after psychologist took the stand, testifying to Joe's long history of untreated mental illness. The defense brought to light his teenage years, during which signs of psychosis and schizophrenia were ignored or dismissed due to his family's lack of access to health care. They explained how these hallucinations and delusions had likely festered for decades, culminating in the warped, violent reality in which Joe now lived. "He is not a killer by choice," said lead defense attorney Brian Keating during his closing argument. "Joe Miller is a profoundly broken man whose untreated mental illness drove him to unimaginable acts. What he heard, what he saw, what he believed, it wasn't real to us, but it wasn't a joke or an excuse to him. He was a puppet at the mercy of his fractured mind." The most controversial moments of the trial came when Joe himself took the stand. Speaking in a monotone voice devoid of emotion, he described in disturbing detail how the voices had taken hold of him. "They told me to mark them," Joe testified, describing the carvings on his victims' bodies as instructions given to him by what he called shadow figures. "Without the symbols it wouldn't be complete. They told me what to do, how to do it. I didn't want to, but I had to." When asked if he felt any remorse, Joe's chilling response was, "I did what needed to be done. Remorse? I don't know if that's part of it." The verdict. After 8 grueling weeks, the case was handed over to the jury. The courtroom was a powder keg of tension as the jurors deliberated for 5 days. Families of the victims held vigils outside, refusing to leave until a verdict was reached. Some hoped Joe would be deemed mentally competent and sentenced to death, while others quietly wondered if there was any truth to his claims of insanity. On a crisp October morning, the jury delivered their decision. Joe Miller was found guilty on all counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. While the verdict brought some measure of justice, it left many in Oakridge feeling hollow. Unanswered questions. Even with the trial concluded and the guilty sentence handed down, the air in Oakridge remained heavy with unanswered questions. The biggest and most haunting of all: was Joe Miller truly insane? To this day, there are those who believe Joe's mental illness was genuine, that he was as much a victim of his own mind as the people he murdered were of his actions. Others argue that his claims of hearing voices and seeing shadow figures were nothing more than a calculated attempt to escape the full weight of the law. Perhaps the most enigmatic question is whether Joe acted entirely alone. The chilling precision of his murders, combined with his avoidance of key evidence trails, left some wondering if there was more to the story. Did Joe's hallucinations stem from his mental illness, or was there someone else guiding him? Detectives found no concrete evidence linking him to a larger conspiracy, but the idea still lingered in the minds of many Oakridge residents. Lingering shadows. For the families of Sarah Dillon, Jennifer Harper, Emily Wright, and Laura James, the trial's conclusion provided some closure, but the pain of their loss was far from resolved. The courtroom had answered who, but failed to fully address why. "It's over for now," Laura's mother said tearfully afterward, "but nothing can bring our girl back. Nothing can take away the horror of what he did." Joe Miller remains on death row to this day, his final appeals dwindling as the years pass. While the town of Oakridge slowly began rebuilding itself, the legacy of fear and tragedy created by the ritual killer continues to loom like an unshakable shadow. The lasting haunt, a town forever marked. The ritual killer's reign of terror might have officially ended with Joe Miller's arrest and conviction, but the scars he left behind have never fully healed. Oakridge, once considered a peaceful and idyllic town tucked away in Oregon's lush forests, became synonymous with fear, grief, and unanswered questions. In the months and years that followed, the psychological weight of the murders continued to hang over the town like a dark, inescapable cloud, a haunting presence that residents carried with them every single day. The families left behind. For the families of the 4 victims, the end of Joe Miller's trial brought no solace. The loss of Sarah Dillon, Jennifer Harper, Emily Wright, and Laura James left holes in the hearts of those who loved them, wounds that time struggled to mend. Memorials for the victims became permanent fixtures across Oakridge. A bench was placed near the Lowell Creek Trail where Sarah's body had been found, engraved with her name and the words, "Forever bright, forever loved." Flowers were often laid there by friends and strangers alike, but the area remained eerily quiet, no longer a place for leisurely hikes, but instead a chilling reminder of what was stolen. Jennifer Harper's flower shop was never reopened. Her sister tried to manage it briefly, hoping to honor Jennifer's passion for spreading beauty in a world darkened by grief, but soon found it too painful to walk through the doors. The shop's windows stayed shuttered, the bright floral sign fading over the years, adding an even greater sense of emptiness to Main Street. Emily Wright's high school friends, once so full of life and dreams of graduation, struggled to make sense of her loss. Many forged ahead in her honor, pursuing creative careers Emily had once inspired them to chase, but school plays and drama club events became somber affairs. One close friend admitted during an interview years later, "Every time I step onto a stage I imagine Emily right there standing beside me. I wish she was." Laura James's family moved away from Oakridge only months after Joe's conviction. Unable to bear the sight of Pinewood Park, the once beloved spot now stained with the memory of their daughter's gruesome death, they left the town behind. However, it wasn't long before other families began whispering of wanting to leave as well. They weren't just running from the memories, they were running from the feeling that Oakridge would never be the same, the town under a shadow. As newspapers, television specials, and even podcasts continued to recount the horrifying details of the ritual killer's crimes, Oakridge became an unintentional tourist attraction. True crime enthusiasts and urban explorers traveled from far and wide to visit the sites connected to Joe Miller's murders. Pinewood Park, once a sanctuary for families and joggers, became an attraction for thrill-seekers who would walk its trails after dark and take selfies near the infamous oak tree. Sarah Dillon's memorial bench became a morbid focal point for bloggers covering the case. "People don't see our town anymore," Margaret Blake, the town librarian, told a reporter years later. "They only see the story. They see the murders. We're not Oakridge. We're the town that made nightmares real. It's like we've been erased and replaced by this chapter of horror." Local businesses suffered immensely as the town tried to recover. Parents remained protective and overcautious. Curfews became unofficial laws. Kids, once allowed to roam free through Oakridge's streets and parks, were now kept indoors where parents deemed them safer, even as crime rates in the years following Joe Miller's arrest returned to their previously non-existent levels. The quaint charm that had once defined Oakridge was gone, replaced by locked doors, closed blinds, and a deep-rooted sense of paranoia. Newcomers to the town were few, and real estate agents struggled to sell homes in the area. Houses and businesses sat abandoned, leaving entire streets feeling eerily empty, as though the ritual killer had drained the soul of the community, along with those of his victims. The survivor's guilt. No one in Oakridge came through the ordeal unchanged. Friends of the victims, and even those who had no direct ties to the murders, found themselves grappling with profound survivor's guilt. They questioned themselves endlessly. Could I have done something to stop this? Should I have noticed something about Joe Miller? Was there a sign I missed? "I keep replaying every moment I interacted with him over and over in my head," said Rick Johnson, the owner of a local diner where Joe had occasionally eaten breakfast before his early shifts at the mortuary. "He seemed normal, maybe a little weird, but not dangerous. And now I can't help but wonder if I just asked one question, just said one thing. Could we have stopped him?" Oakridge's religious leaders played a large role in offering comfort, though faith was often tested during this time. Pastor Charles Emery admitted during a memorial service, "It's hard to tell people the world is still good when we've seen firsthand how cruel it can be, but we have to believe in healing, even when it feels impossible." His words, though heartfelt, were little comfort to those who couldn't reconcile their grief with the senselessness of what had happened. Confronting the narrative. One of the greatest challenges Oakridge faced was trying to regain its identity. Over time, it became clear that the town's name would forever be tied to the ritual killer in books, films, and documentaries. A streaming network released a limited series dramatizing the events, complete with suspenseful reenactments of the murders and exaggerated portrayals of the victims and investigators. While the series was popular, many residents felt disgusted by it. "They made it into entertainment," said one former teacher of Emily Wright. "They turned all this pain into a story that people could watch with popcorn, and it isn't fair. It isn't fair to Emily, to any of them." Oakridge fought to reclaim its image, though the process was slow and bittersweet. A community initiative to plant new flowers throughout the town aimed to brighten up forgotten areas. Murals were painted, one depicting Emily's dream of becoming an actress and Sarah's radiant smile under a vibrant blue sky, but reminders of the past were never far, lurking just beneath the surface. A lingering fear. Even with the ritual killer behind bars, many residents struggled to shake the feeling that more horror could be just around the corner. The traumatized community became hyper-aware of every strange face, every unusual movement, every innocent coincidence that might suggest something darker. For years after Joe Miller's conviction, rumors would emerge of other strange occurrences. A boy reported seeing a man in a black hoodie watching him from the woods. Several received prank calls late at night, with the caller mimicking Joe's eerie phrase during his arrest, "I had to finish." Though no evidence ever linked these incidents to a real threat, they reinforced the wholly natural fear that lightning could strike twice. The legacy of the ritual killer. Joe Miller sits on death row to this day, his appeals dwindling and his public mentions gradually fading as time moves on. And yet for Oakridge, his name has become a permanent dark stain on their history, a ghost that lingers long after the headlines disappeared. "People look at us like we're cursed," said Lisa Morgan, a longtime resident. "Like we're this haunted place, and maybe we are. But if we are, it's not because of him. It's because we lost so much and we have to live with that every day." For Oakridge, the story doesn't feel over, not really. The ritual killer may be gone, but his shadow, that will hang over the town for generations to come. A reminder. Lessons from darkness. The story of the ritual killer is not just a cautionary tale of crime and tragedy. It is a haunting reminder of the fragile line between safety and chaos, between ignorance and action. Though Oakridge will forever bear the scars of those dark months, Its legacy extends far beyond the borders of the quiet Oregon town. The lessons left behind by the ritual killer's reign of terror are not just for those who lived it. They are reminders for us all. The ripple effect of untreated mental illness. One of the most sobering aspects of Joe Miller's story was the revelation of his untreated and unacknowledged mental illness. As investigators unraveled his past, it became clear that signs were there all along. The strange behavior during his youth, the obsession with death, the chilling sketches in the margins of his schoolwork. These red flags were marked by neglect, stigma, and a lack of adequate mental health resources for struggling teens in small, underfunded communities. Joe's story shouldn't be an excuse for what he did, said Dr. Allison Fry, a criminologist who consulted on the case. But this could have been stopped. He was a ticking time bomb, not because he wanted to be, but because years of untreated psychosis warped his mind beyond comprehension. This tragedy is as much a failure of the system as it is of one man. Joe Miller was not the first person with untreated mental illness to turn toward darkness, and he will not be the last. Experts, both local and national, have stressed the importance of identifying and addressing mental health warnings early, which includes education about understanding the signs of mental illness and breaking down the barriers of stigma that prevent many individuals from seeking help. Mental health and communities. The murders in Oakridge underscored the broader issue of mental health awareness, especially in small or tight-knit communities where resources are limited and problems are often brushed aside. In the wake of the ritual killer's arrest, towns throughout Oregon began to re-examine how accessible mental health care was to their residents. Did children in schools have access to counselors? Could struggling adults talk to someone without fear of judgment or expense? This case taught us that complacency can cost lives, said Jessica Hammond, a teacher in Oakridge who helped push for more trauma and mental health education in her local school board. We can't keep pretending this doesn't happen in small towns. We have to get ahead of it, even when it's uncomfortable to have those conversations. Local advocacy grew stronger after the case, with programs and workshops being introduced for parents, educators, and workplaces to discuss mental health prevention and intervention. While these efforts were a step forward, they also served as painful reminders of the lives that were lost before such measures were adopted. The fragile fabric of community security. Perhaps the most universal lesson revealed by the ritual killer case is how quickly the rigid boundaries of safety can collapse under fear. Oakridge had long been considered a peaceful haven, a town where people left their doors unlocked, where neighbors trusted one another implicitly. But the murders exposed vulnerabilities that no one wanted to confront before. It woke us up to how fragile security really is, said Rick Johnson, a longtime resident. We all thought we lived in this bubble of safety, like nothing bad ever happens here. But bubbles burst. It can happen anywhere. Oakridge, Chicago, the smallest dot on the map. Thinking otherwise is just denial. On a national scale, the Oakridge murders prompted conversations about community vigilance and balancing trust with caution. Law enforcement agencies around the country began implementing more community-focused policing programs, urging citizens to report suspicious activity without the fear of causing unnecessary panic. The case even led to more widespread use of security cameras in public and private spaces, though some criticized the measures as invasions of privacy. The importance of community unity. While Oakridge's spirit suffered under the weight of fear and grief, the ritual killer's horrific acts also shed light on how vital community solidarity is in times of crisis. After the initial terror that ripped through the town, neighbors began coming together, not just to mourn, but to protect and rebuild. Candlelight vigils became regular occurrences where residents honored the victims and vowed to reclaim the town's sense of unity. Trauma counselors and crisis teams were brought in to help residents process their emotions and move toward healing. Faith leaders opened their doors to anyone who needed support, regardless of their religious beliefs. This wasn't something any one person could get through alone, said Margaret Blake, the town librarian and community organizer. That's what I hope people take from this. When horror strikes, the only way forward is together. Even years later, these lessons extended far beyond Oakridge as programs and organizations began prioritizing disaster response for communities grappling with trauma. The tragedy became a rallying cry for small towns across America to invest in their people, to rebuild trust, offer support, and never give in to the isolation fear can breed. The thin line between fame and exploitation. Another harsh truth revealed by Oakridge's story was society's obsession with true crime, a fascination that often walks a fine line between awareness and exploitation. After Joe Miller's arrest, Oakridge became the focus of national news, documentaries, podcasts, and true crime enthusiasts, all eager to dissect the ritual killer case. Pinewood Park, the site of Laura James' murder, was no longer a place of quiet reflection but a tourist hotspot where people snapped photos and whispered about the horrors that had taken place. For them, it was excitement, said Lisa Morgan, a local. For us, it was real lives, real families, torn apart. There's a difference between wanting justice and turning it into entertainment. While some Oakridge residents welcomed the attention as a way to ensure the victims were always remembered, others found it distasteful and invasive. In many ways, the public scrutiny added another layer of trauma for the victims' families, who felt as though their loved ones' lives had been reduced to stories for books or TV. The call for vigilance and empathy. The legacy of the ritual killer is a complicated one. On one hand, it serves as a grim warning of what can happen when the signs of a fractured mind are ignored, when security is taken for granted, and when communities dismiss their vulnerabilities. On the other hand, it reminds us that even in darkness, lessons can be learned, and lives can find new meaning and purpose. For Oakridge and the countless others who learned from its tragedy, the takeaway is crystal clear. Vigilance, empathy, and action are the pillars of safety and survival. Don't wait until it happens in your backyard to care, Margaret Blake emphasized at a memorial years after the murders. Learn from us. Look out for the ones who need help, even when they don't ask. Protect the people you love. And when fear knocks, draw strength from the people standing beside you. Never again. As the years pass, the ritual killer's shadow over Oakridge may fade, but its lessons endure. Preventing future tragedies like this one requires more than just remembering. It demands action, compassion, and vigilance. Because at the heart of every chilling true crime story are the humanity, hearts, and futures that were lost. Oakridge will always carry the weight of its dark chapter, but with it comes the unrelenting hope that no town will have to go through what it did ever again.